We have to have a properly managed migration program. In terms of the permanent migration program, which is running at about 185,000 a year now, that we will reduce that to 140,000.
The biggest thing that you could do, area where you could reduce the amount, is in students, because some of that, frankly, was being abused. We want people to come here who are involved in construction.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Jones and welcome to the second in our series of bonus episodes of the Bloomberg Australia podcast, coming to your earbuds every Tuesday as we count down to the Australian federal election. Each week, we scour the nation for the sharpest takes on the biggest issues that will decide what box Aussie voters will check come May 3rd. Today, to help me unpack the issue of immigration and how that may play out in the coming election, I have one of the best qualified people for the job, Dr. Abul Rizvi, who holds a PhD in immigration policy from the University of Melbourne and was a senior executive and then the Deputy Secretary at the Department of Immigration, where he worked for more than 16 years. Abul, welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca.
So let's start with the basics. We've seen an uptick in immigration since the pandemic. Why has that happened?
It happened for a couple of reasons. The first was, prior to COVID, the government had put in place policies that were steadily leading to an increase in overseas students coming to Australia. During COVID, and particularly towards the end of COVID, the government put in place a number of policies that really would have accelerated immigration, net migration, if there was a strong labour market. And those two things coincided. And the moment they coincided, we got the zoom in immigration that we got as soon as international borders reopened. In fact, the labour market was so strong through 2022 that Mr. Dutton in September 2022 said, we do need to increase the level of migration, but he was sceptical the government could achieve the increase quickly enough. And it was only 6 to 12 months after that that Mr. Dutton was saying, oh, the immigration numbers are totally out of control. How could this have happened? Well, it was pretty obvious why it happened.
And I think, it's been quite interesting what has dominated the news cycle since the pandemic. And one of the key things, you can't pick up a newspaper, log on to a news website without seeing the words cost of living crisis and housing crisis. I want to talk a little bit about the interconnectedness of policy, specifically about those two elements, immigration and housing. I think anyone with, even a cursory understanding of policy would guess that it's not a linear equation, right, where one family of immigrants equals one new house required. Can you break it down for me? I'd also like to understand a little bit better anything about that equation that is particularly unique to Australia.
Well, different types of migrants have different demands on immigration, on housing. So, for example, a working holidaymaker who tends to travel quite a bit through Australia, particularly through regional Australia, will tend to live in backpacker accommodation that most Aussies probably wouldn't use. Overseas students similarly tend to congregate around the CBD of our major cities, and they tend to use apartments rather than suburban houses. So they have, again, a different demand on housing. We then have family migrants, predominantly partners, dependent children and parents, who tend to live with their sponsors, so they don't actually increase demand for housing. So as you're breaking this down, you have to think about the composition of the intake in terms of what impact it will have on demand.
In terms of the amount of housing required, is it fair to blame immigrants for the housing crisis? Are they the cause of this? Even when we account for those Aussies that go on their study abroad, working holidays overseas, fall in love with a foreign person, want to marry them and bring them back home, they probably won't be taking up a whole other house. They may be moving in with the parents or something like that. It's more complicated though, right, isn't it?
Absolutely. There are multiple drivers of our current housing crisis. And as I think a number of analysts have written, this has been coming at us for 20 to 30 years. The failure of governments to put in place adequate housing policies to accommodate our growing population.
Why can't they get it right?
That's a very good question. I think part of the problem is that housing policy is predominantly the responsibility of state governments, whereas immigration policy is predominantly the responsibility of the Commonwealth government. And the two always have difficulties in coordinating.
And that is something I would imagine is quite unique to Australia as well. We do have this system of state and federal and, local councils governing all different bits of our lives, quite unique to Australia. Is there any examples from abroad? I know you're a scholar of immigration too. That's what your whole PhD's in, right? That we could potentially use for inspiration. Has anyone else got it right where we haven't?
Well, certainly if you look at how governments in Scandinavia have managed this, they have managed it. They've had relatively rapid population growth too, but they have not had the housing crisis that we have had. And their housing policies are really quite different to Australia's, as is the situation in most of Europe, where long-term rental is a more natural approach for most people, whereas in Australia, owning your home is the big deal.
And that's certainly something that the Albanese government has been looking at, is this build-to-rent scheme and, in challenging the idea of what the great Australian dream might be. Peter Dutton has taken a different tact, and he's looking at cutting international student numbers, pledging to limit the commencements to 240,000. That's some 30,000 fewer than what Labor is proposing. I know, Abul, you've said in the past that caps are a poor policy tool. Why is that?
Because the cap on each provider would have to be firstly renegotiated every year, an extraordinarily complex and difficult and fraught process where no one will agree to the allocation they get given. And then we run that process again every year with 1,400 providers. Absolute nightmare. Secondly, caps don't provide certainty in terms of providers planning how they should work their business for the next few years. They have to wait every year for that fraught negotiation on the cap. Thirdly, caps do nothing about the quality of the student that we're attracting. They do nothing about the quality of education provided. They do nothing about issues of integrity in this space, and integrity is very important in this space. They do nothing about targeting the skills we need. And targeting skills is really important. I can't think of a positive for caps.
You hit on something really, really poignant there. I think back to when I was at uni and some of my best mates were from other places, right? The US, Malaysia, Japan. Now, they all pretty much packed up and left straight after graduation. And to me, like at least on a personal level, that was kind of sad to see those big brains just walking out the door. Now, I know Australia's Group of 8, like the big university groups here, seem to be concerned about cutting these international student numbers and the risk that poses to their reputation as service providers. But Abul, should they be taking a more longer-term view here?
I think they need to be taking a longer-term, more holistic view. Ultimately, the government is responsible for managing net overseas migration. That is the rate at which immigration contributes to Australia's population growth. And overseas students must fit within that as a subset to that. At the moment, we have a situation where the universities are saying, no, we're separate from all that. We don't count in all of that. Well, you can't pretend that. That's not the case. Students form part of Australia's population whilst they're here, and if they remain here long term, they remain part of the population. Universities can't ignore that. The big issue in terms of students is the portion of students who get left in immigration limbo. That is, people who have invested a fortune in getting a pathway to permanent residence can't get it, either because they haven't studied the right area, can't get a job in the right area, etc., or there aren't enough places. So they're stuck in that situation and can't go home having spent $150,000 in trying to get permanent residence. The size of that group is the public policy problem. If you can keep the size of that group small, the system's running well. If the size of that group becomes very large, you're in trouble. And that's why the universities can't just keep growing numbers unless they can keep the size of that group relatively small.
What percentage do students make of Australia's overall immigration picture, just so we can get some broader context here?
So in any one year, students represent between 40 to 50% of net migration.
It's massive.
They represent a bigger portion of net migration than permanent residents, or skilled temporary entrants, or working holiday makers, or visitors.
And even if we wanted to curb immigration substantially, is that even possible? Are there just jobs that we can't fill with Australians, either, of working age or, of students about to graduate? What are the numbers sort of tell us about that?
There are fundamentally two reasons why we can't reduce immigration to the kinds of levels that, for example, Mr. Dutton was talking about, and certainly not to the kinds of levels that Pauline Hanson and others are suggesting. And that's for it's actually for three reasons. One, we have a family migration program where we fundamentally say, if you as an Aussie decide to marry a foreigner, we think you have a right to live with that foreigner in Australia. And I think most people would think, oh yeah, that's fair enough. And that's why we have a law which says governments can't prevent you, if you've married your foreigner, that you can't bring that person to Australia to live with you. So that's a fundamental bedrock that you can't get around. Secondly, you're absolutely right. There are jobs that we cannot possibly fill in the short term, and that will always be the case because of the dynamic nature of the population, the economy. It's constantly changing, and so demand constantly changes. You can certainly tell which way demand is going to head. I mean, it is absolutely inevitable that demand in the health and ageing space will just keep rising. It just will not stop, and we can't pretend that it's going to stop. Third reason is a demographic reason. The lower that you drive net migration, the faster we age and the more quickly we bring forward the date in which deaths exceed births in Australia. Over the next 50 years, the vast majority of countries on the planet will reach a point where deaths exceed births. That is a situation the human race has never before encountered. There will, over the next 50 years, be an extraordinary competition for young skilled migrants in a context where the vast majority of countries are facing a situation where deaths exceed births.
And that's certainly the case in places like China too, isn't it?
A lot more countries will go there in the next 50 years, including India.
And when we come back, Australia isn't the only place where immigration is playing a role in its elections. This is the Bloomberg Australia podcast. And welcome back to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. You're here with me, Rebecca Jones, and I'm talking to Abul Rizvi about migration policy ahead of the Australian election. This is a special bonus episode, part 2 of a series of exclusive sit-downs with experts around Australia. You can find last week's episode wherever you listen, and indeed the complete archive of all our conversations there too. Now, immigration policy is something that governments and people talk about all over the world. We saw how it showed up in the exit of Canada's PM, Justin Trudeau, and for a certain new/old occupant in the White House, well, is there any part of our lives that Donald Trump isn't affecting right now? Abul, do you think that either major party here in Australia is being influenced by Trump's MAGA approach to migration? And are we seeing that filter through to the political debate here?
Sadly, I think that is the case. What we're seeing is things like, as you're aware, in the previous Trump administration, they wanted to implement a Muslim ban. How you'd ever implement one of those, I have absolutely no idea, and I managed Australia's migration system for a decade. It just wouldn't work. And that's what Trump found out, and he moved to a different sort of ban where he banned people from certain countries. But even that was limited in how it worked. I suspect he will now... his administration is now taking an approach where they are less likely to observe due process in terms of people's rights, and people will get deported, people will get refused, people will get turned around at the airport for reasons that are quite bewildering. What it's leading to in America is that the number of overseas visitors to America has plunged. Not surprising, but has plunged. And I think what that will do is hurt America in many, many ways. Most directly and immediately, it will smash its international tourism industry. And I don't think Mr. Trump thinks much about services exports, but tourism is a major services export for the United States. I would not want to be the owner of a hotel, an airline, an attraction, Disneyland right now in the United States. And
do you think it is only a matter of time before we start seeing those, even ideologies that Trump is offering filter through to our public discourse here in Australia?
I think that's right. I think in particular the deportation side of Mr. Trump's policies. I am surprised up till now, whilst Pauline Hanson has talked about mass deportation, Mr. Dutton has not yet done that. Whether he decides to turn to that later in the election, I don't know. I suspect, having been immigration minister, he understands how phenomenally difficult mass deportation would be, and that may lead to him not going down that Trumpist path. But if he gets desperate enough, he may choose to do that. I think Australians should understand that mass deportation is, no matter how attractive you think it is extraordinarily difficult, and Mr. Trump is gradually working that out.
Do you think that leading up to May 3rd, that immigration is going to be one of those key influences that motivate Australians to vote one way or the other? It strikes me as interesting that you talk to a group of younger people, say Gen Z, first-time voters. Would they be able to tell you, I know you know the answer, who coined the phrase "stop the boats"? Is the level of education and productive public debate around these sort of issues enough for Australians to make an informed decision come voting day, or should we be doing more?
I think on average around the world, Aussies aren't too bad at understanding immigration. There's a reasonably good, because we've been doing it since World War II at an extraordinary level. And so Australians have understood it. Having said that, our politicians for the last 20 years appear to have given up on the idea of explaining the rationale of Australia's immigration policy to the public. I recall Philip Ruddock used to every year religiously go around the country running town hall meetings, internet wasn't that used in those days, to explain immigration policy. And he would sit there for an hour and a half taking questions on immigration policy and explaining it to Australians. And there used to be lots of media at those town hall type meetings, and that helped, I think, Australians understand. Over the last 20 years, our politicians have become very timid about explaining the rationale for immigration policy to the Australian public. As a result, I think there probably is a portion of the population that is now quite ignorant on how it all works.
So as someone, finally, who has led Australia's migration program for years, has studied it for even longer, if you were still running the migration program, Abul, what advice would you give Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese?
I would love it if either of them would make a commitment to saying, we are going to have a rational immigration policy. We're going to commission proper research into what our long-term net migration level should be, and we are going to put in place arrangements to ensure Australians understand the target, that we have a framework for delivering the target, and that we have a single minister responsible for delivering that target. That would be a great outcome, I think, because it would give the Australian public confidence that the government is managing the program in our national interest, and that's what we desperately need.
Some great insight there. Abul, so great to chat today. Thank you for joining me.
You're welcome, Rebecca.
And thank you for listening to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. I'm Rebecca Jones. This episode was recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Dharawal people. It was produced by Paul Allen and edited by Chris Burke, Ainsley Chandler and Amy Bainbridge. Don't forget to follow and review the show wherever you get your podcasts, and sign up to Bloomberg's free daily newsletter, Australia Briefing. Go to bloomberg.com to subscribe.